The first thing I remember is the sound of a canning jar slipping out of my hand and striking the edge of the sink. It did not break. It only rolled in a slow circle across the wooden counter while I stood there with both hands pressed against my belly, trying to breathe through a pain that had started low in my back and wrapped around my sides. It was a little after 5 in the morning. The stove was already hot. There were biscuits in the oven, 2 pails waiting by the door, and I could hear my husband outside hitching the horse. I was 7 months pregnant, and I remember looking at that jar and thinking, if it had shattered, at least somebody would have heard it. That morning was the first time I admitted to myself that I could not keep doing everything exactly as I had done it before. My name is Katie, and I grew up Old Order Amish. I share these stories because there are things about our way of life that can look very simple from the outside and feel much more complicated when you are the one living inside them. If you have ever been expected to keep going because everybody around you seemed to think you should be able to, tell me in the comments. I think more people understand that feeling than we sometimes admit. I want to be careful about something from the beginning. I am not telling you that every Amish wife is treated the same during pregnancy. I can only tell you what was expected in my family, in the church district I knew, and in my own marriage at that time. The word accept was used often when I was growing up. You accepted the weather. You accepted the harvest you were given. You accepted that work still had to be done when you were tired. You accepted advice from women older than you because they had already walked the road you were walking. And after I married, I learned that there were also things a wife was expected to accept without turning them into a public complaint. Pregnancy did not erase those expectations. In some ways, it made them more visible. I was 21 when I was pregnant with my first child. By then I had been married long enough to know the rhythm of our home without looking at a clock. In summer, I woke around 4:45. In winter, it could be a little later, but never much. I dressed in the dark, pinned my hair, tied my apron, stirred the stove, and started breakfast. On wash day, there were kettles to heat. On baking day, there was flour everywhere by sunrise. In garden season, there were beans, tomatoes, cucumbers, onions, and whatever else had decided to ripen all at once. None of that felt strange to me. I had watched my mother work through pregnancies. I had watched aunts carry babies on one hip and laundry on the other. Hard work was not presented to us as punishment. It was simply life, and I took a kind of pride in being able to do it. During the first months of my pregnancy, I was almost stubborn about proving that nothing had changed. I lifted laundry baskets the same way. I carried feed buckets. I helped with the garden. If I felt sick in the morning, I waited until it passed and went on. If I became tired in the afternoon, I sat for 5 minutes instead of 20. I did not want anyone to look at me and think I was using pregnancy as an excuse. That fear was stronger than I understood at the time. It came from many small comments gathered over years. A woman might say about another woman, "She has always been delicate." Or someone might laugh and say, "We all had babies and still got supper on the table." Nobody needed to point at me directly. I knew the standard. There were also practical reasons for it. In a farm household, work does not disappear because one person is tired. Cows still need attention, children still need feeding. Vegetables do not wait politely in the garden until your back stops hurting. When there are no electric machines doing half the work, a missed chore often becomes a doubled chore later. I understood that. What I did not understand was the difference between accepting responsibility and pretending I had no limits. By the 5th month, my body was changing faster than my habits. I could no longer bend over the same way. My shoes felt tight by evening. I started waking at night with cramps in my legs. There were mornings when the smell of frying meat made me so sick I had to step outside. But I kept my routine almost exactly the same. I told myself that women before me had done more with less. That sentence became a kind of whip in my own mind. Women before me had done more with less, so I should not complain. Women before me had given birth to large families, so one pregnancy should not defeat me. Women before me had worked through summer heat, so I should not ask to lie down when the kitchen felt like an oven. I was measuring myself against women whose private moments I had never seen. I knew what they had done in public. I did not know how many times they had cried behind a closed pantry door. My husband was not a cruel man. I want to say that plainly because memory becomes unfair if you simplify people into heroes and villains. He had been raised with his own expectations. He believed providing meant working until the work was finished. If he was sick, he still went to the barn. If his back hurt, he still lifted what needed lifting. When I told him I was tired, he heard it through the same rule he used on himself. Tired does not mean finished. He would say, rest after dinner, or we can turn in early tonight. But the work before dinner remained the same. The first time I asked him to carry the wash water for me, he looked surprised, not angry. He said, "You carried it last week." I remember answering, "I know." I could not explain why that sentence hurt. Of course I had carried it last week. Last week my belly had not felt this heavy. Last week I had not spent half the night awake. Last week was not today. Still, I carried the water. That was another thing I thought a wife had to accept. If someone could not see your discomfort, you had to prove you could live with it. By the 6th month, people started giving me advice. Most of it was kindly meant. Eat more of this. Avoid too much of that. Do not sit around too much, or the birth will be harder. Keep moving. Do not get nervous. Do not listen to frightening birth stories. Listen to older women. Do not make yourself anxious by asking too many questions. Some advice contradicted other advice, but I treated all of it as instruction. I did not yet know how to say, that may have been true for you, but I need to pay attention to what is happening in my own body. In our home, privacy was also different from what many people might expect now. Pregnancy was personal, but it was not private in the modern sense. Older women noticed how I carried, how much weight I had gained, whether my ankles were swollen, whether I looked pale. They asked questions that would probably feel intrusive to many people. I had grown up around that, so I did not think it was unusual. What became difficult was that everyone seemed to have an opinion about what I should endure, while I was the only one actually inside my body. On one Sunday afternoon, after a meal with relatives, I stood up from a bench and became so dizzy that the room narrowed into a dark tunnel. I grabbed the edge of the table and waited for it to pass. Nobody made a great fuss. One woman told me to sit. Another brought water. 10 minutes later, the conversation had moved on. I remember feeling embarrassed, as though I had interrupted the afternoon. That embarrassment told me something about myself. I was more afraid of being inconvenient than I was of being unwell. The 7th month came during a stretch of hot weather, the kind of heat that settles in the upstairs rooms before noon and seems to stay trapped there even after dark. Our bedroom window was open every night, but the air barely moved. I slept with one foot outside the sheet and still woke damp with sweat. My hands were puffy in the mornings. By supper, my ankles had deep marks from my stockings. I was slower at everything. A basket that had once taken 1 trip took 2. I sat down to peel potatoes instead of standing. I started leaving the heaviest pots on the table because lifting them from the floor made me feel a pulling ache low in my belly. Small changes, quiet changes. I made them without announcing them because I still wanted the household to look normal from the outside. Then came the week I broke down. It was not one dramatic event. That is what I want people to understand. Sometimes breaking down does not come from one terrible thing. Sometimes it comes from 50 ordinary things stacked on top of one another until the last one is almost ridiculous. That morning, I had been awake since 3 because the baby kept pressing in a way that made it hard to get comfortable. At 4:30, I gave up sleeping. I went downstairs, lit the stove, and started breakfast. I burned the first pan of biscuits because I sat down for what I thought was a minute and closed my eyes. The smell woke me. I scraped the dark bottoms and told myself nobody would care. Then I remembered we were low on clean towels, so I heated water. Then I noticed jars from the previous day had not been put away. Then one of the pails by the back door had a crack and was leaking onto the floor. Then my husband came in and asked whether I had packed what he needed for the day. He did not ask sharply. That almost made it worse. It was an ordinary question on an ordinary morning. I looked at him and could not remember what he was talking about. He repeated himself. I said, "I forgot." He said, "Can you do it now?" I nodded. I walked back to the counter. That is when the canning jar slipped from my hand. It hit the edge of the sink and rolled in that slow circle. My back tightened. I pressed my hands against my belly. I heard the horse outside. I smelled the burned biscuits. I saw water spreading from the cracked pail, and something in me simply stopped. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not on a chair, on the floor, my apron spread around me, and I cried so hard I could not speak. I do not mean a few tears. I mean the kind of crying where your whole body shakes, and you are embarrassed even while it is happening because you cannot make it quiet. My husband stood there completely still. He had seen me cry before, but not like that. He asked if I was hurt. I shook my head. He asked if something was wrong with the baby. I said I did not know. Then he asked what was wrong, and I remember saying, "Everything is still expected of me." Those were the words. Everything is still expected of me. He looked confused. He said, "I thought you were managing." And that sentence opened something in me. I told him I was managing because I believed I was not allowed to do anything else. I told him every time I slowed down, I heard somebody's voice in my head saying women had always done this. I told him I was tired of being compared to women who were not standing in our kitchen. I told him I was afraid that if I asked for help too often, he would think less of me. I told him I had started hiding how much my back hurt because I did not want anyone calling me delicate. None of this was eloquent. I said it between breaths, wiping my face with the corner of my apron. The kitchen floor was hard under my legs. The stove was too hot. The biscuits were ruined. It is strange what details you remember when your pride finally gives way. My husband did not have some perfect answer. I think people sometimes rewrite memories to make them cleaner than they were. He did not kneel down and suddenly understand every feeling I had. He stood there for a while. Then he picked up the cracked pail, carried it outside, came back, and put the kettle off the hottest part of the stove. Finally he said, "I did not know you thought you had to hide it from me." I answered, "I did not know I was hiding it until now." Later that morning, my mother came by. I had not asked for her, but word travels quickly in a family, even when nobody intends gossip. She found me sitting at the table with my feet on a low stool. I expected advice. I expected her to tell me that she had worked harder during pregnancy than I was working. Instead, she looked at my swollen hands for a long moment and said, "A body can be obedient and still be tired." That was all. One sentence. I have remembered it for years. She did not tell me to stop being responsible. She did not tell me that every expectation around me was wrong. She gave me permission to understand something I should have understood already. Endurance is not the same as silence. That week, small things changed. Not everything. Small things. My husband started carrying the wash water. Without waiting for me to ask, I stopped lifting the heaviest baskets. On hot afternoons, I lay down for half an hour after the noon meal. If someone came by and saw me resting, I let them see me. That last part was harder than any chore. I had become so used to looking capable that being visibly tired felt almost indecent. I also began saying no in plain ways, not angry ways, plain ways. If someone asked whether I could help with an extra task, I would say, "Not today." The first few times, my heart pounded after I said it. Nobody expelled me from the community. Nobody stood up in church to condemn me. Most people simply adjusted. That taught me that some of the rules I feared were never actually spoken as rules. They were expectations I had absorbed, strengthened, and then enforced on myself. Other expectations were real. There was still work that had to be done. There were still people who thought I was becoming soft. There were still comments. But after that morning on the kitchen floor, those comments no longer had the same authority over me. I had learned the cost of letting everybody else's idea of strength become more important than what my own body was telling me. Looking back now, the hardest thing I had to accept during pregnancy was not the physical discomfort. It was the idea that a good wife should make her discomfort easy for everyone else to ignore. That belief did more harm to me than the early mornings, the heat, or the heavy baskets. I thought being faithful meant never becoming a burden. I thought being useful meant never needing anything. I thought being strong meant nobody should be able to tell when I was struggling. I do not believe that anymore. I still believe in work. I still believe in responsibility. I still believe families sometimes carry one another through seasons that are inconvenient and exhausting. But carrying one another means the weight moves. It does not stay on one person's shoulders while everybody praises her for standing upright. Pregnancy taught me that a household can look peaceful while one person inside it is quietly running out of strength. It also taught me that speaking before you collapse is not selfish. Sometimes it is the most responsible thing you can do. I wish I had understood that before month 7. I wish I had said, "This is too heavy for me now," the first time it became true. I wish I had trusted that asking for help did not erase all the work I had already done. But maybe that is why I tell the story now. Not because I want you to look at my life and decide that every Amish wife lives the same way. We do not. Families differ. Church districts differ. People differ. I tell it because the pressure to look capable is not only an Amish problem. You may live in an apartment in a city and still know exactly what I mean. You may have electricity, a washing machine, a car in the driveway, and still be afraid to admit that you cannot keep carrying everything at once. If there is one thing I understand now, it is this. Strength that requires you to disappear inside your own life is too expensive. I was 7 months pregnant before I finally learned to say I was tired out loud. I hope you do not have to reach the kitchen floor before you give yourself the same permission. If you want more stories about the parts of Amish life that are ordinary on the surface and more complicated underneath, you can subscribe and stay with me here. And I would really like to know this from you. Have you ever kept saying you were fine because you thought everybody needed you to be? If you are comfortable sharing, tell me in the comments. I read more of them than you might think.